and we're now open for questions, interventions from anyone who would like to speak. And we've got Abayomi from Nigeria is the first up.
Hello, Abayomi.
You just need to unmute.
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation on a very fascinating subject.
You are so welcome.
Thank you. What happens in the process of this channel?
Hi, Abayomi,
You're breaking up a
very
bit.
delayed. Please, can you turn your video off and then the sound will
Okay,
be...
Thank you. Maybe it will be better this way. I wanted to find out, what do you experience in yourself in the process of channeling? Do you ever channel in any other language than in the English language?
Well, those are great questions. I don't, it's so funny. I remain conscious. I should have mentioned that I'm a conscious channeler. I go into a light trance state. So I'm aware of what's coming through as it's coming through, but my job is to not get my ego in the way, not finish anyone's sentences. I concentrate on each letter, each word to make sure they're correct. So it's almost like they're streaming through me. It's like streaming on demand. that's how they seem to me. And I'm sorry, what was your second question, Abayomi? Sorry.
Yes, I was asking if you ever channeled in another language than English.
I have had a couple, thank you, another great question. I have had a couple of experiences where Rose spelled out non-English words and I sounded them out, and then I found out later that it was a German word or whatever. Now, I don't believe Hildegard spoke English. She was German, so was Goethe. I don't know if he spoke English either. So apparently there is a translation layer before it gets to me. I don't speak any other languages fluently, and in fact, I'm not very good at them at all. So thank you.
Interesting that if you read Swedenborg, which is one of the places I started my own journey, then he explains that the universal language of the spiritual world is telepathic. Mm-hmm. And so you'd be able to pick up the thoughts telepathically and then translate them into English.
I think that sounds right.
And so you don't need to learn this spiritual language. We know it already. Apparently.
As does every creature.
Exactly. Yes, even our horses and our dogs, they know it too.
Ants and everybody, yeah.
So we're going to Tadeusz and Elizabeth.
Joanna, Tadeusz, I have a question. Most of the statements made by spirits in inverted commas through mediums are points of what we should do or should not do, what affects us here in this world. I am curious, and by the way, my father once talked to me through a medium for 10 minutes or so and explained what happens after one dies, what his experiences were. But what I wonder is, have any of these spirits, in inverted commas, said anything about what happens afterwards? Because my personal feeling is that you are not going to stay ad infinitum in an environment, in a dimension where you can be in contact with us, the living beings, that in due course you go to a higher level. Have any of them mentioned anything about that?
Well, yes, they do talk about moving on into sort of healing places, Jane Roberts' sanitarium, Anthony Bourdain's rehab. They don't stay there long. Adding to the complexity, though, of these answers is this idea that time is simultaneous. So I suspect that, this blueprint of them after they pass, but before they move on to healing, still exists. So I would say, it's not, it sounds like an easy answer, to have, but it really is sort of both. There is moving on, but then there is some staying the same.
And
I'm not
that's
sure that
really
answered.
the Carrie's day asks more or less the same thing. Do the authors stay within the orbit of the Earth, or do they travel to other reaches of the universe and to other planets to have different existences?
Yes, yes, they do. Now, I don't know about, exactly how long. I mean, I know that there are spiritual traditions that have a pretty good understanding of the body itself, that it takes 3 days for the spirit to leave the body, or something like that. They did not talk about that specifically. They mainly focused on going as themselves, but then finding healing beyond that. I hope that answered your question.
Well, in a way, yes. My personal feeling is that our spirit, whilst in our present body, is at one dimension, one level. When we pass away, we are in another dimension. But thereafter, in that other dimension, we also still learn things. And thereafter, we pass to yet another and another dimension until we reach somewhere or other, whatever that is. And I wondered whether any of the spirits that have talked to you talk about changing or going through various dimensions higher and higher.
Oh, yes. Sorry, I get what you're saying now. Yes, in fact, it isn't just up. It seems to be sideways. It seems to be in almost any other dimension. And in fact, there was someone, I think Judy maybe, who commented on chat about, maybe, I'm not sure if Judy, I know you have a question, I want to answer it. But someone commented that, where do they have the authors talked about other areas that they've accessed? And yes, indeed, Einstein in particular talks about these other areas of consciousness that he's already had a habit of going into other areas of consciousness. I think that explains his brilliance. And so he's still doing that. And all of these other dimensions that there are permissions for, however that works, they are able to do that according to what they're saying. So yes, and in fact, Goethe says that he's been around too, but he still believes that our physical reality is the best one, the most beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll just go on to this one before coming to Peter and Mount Fuji. I find the emphasis on further developing self and selfhood by Robin Williams and others curious in the light of Buddhist ideas that the self must be transcended or moved beyond. Do you have any thoughts on this? And I think what you were saying was becoming more, and also becoming more identified with the universal self, which is in the sense the ultimate self, out of which all the transient selves, as it were, are manifestations.
I think we have been taught well about ascension, the idea of ascending. And certainly that seems to be foundational in the Buddhist teachings. Although it's important, and this is what Wilbur, who has studied a lot of, spiritual traditions and authors, says, is that we also need to include them. Transcend and include is where it's at. And so we are those Russian dolls. We don't forget about our previous selves. They're part of all this. And so I think there's, a habit of sort of considering our lesser or our past selves inferior. And I think that is really part of our problem, that we have trouble accepting who we were. And as part of the whole beautiful construct of our reality, there are always going to be, those of us who are trying to catch up. In fact, I think one of the reasons why I am doing what I'm doing, why I'm doing this book, is because I have a fondness for those sort of people who are really trying, who are not ascended masters, because they're all of them are teachers, right? All of them are our teachers. So, I really want to just say that let's not go get so enamored with ascension and forget about our descending currents too, being in the world, you know, and loving all of our frailties, all of our human frailties, all the problems of the world too.
Thank you. Tim, do you want to come back on any of that or make a further comment? I see you're unmuted.
Okay. Yeah, that explanation makes sense to me. I think I was initially maybe confusing the idea of self and selfhood that the authors were giving you as being a more limited egoic type of sense. But if you expand it to include maybe the larger sense that David alluded to, then it makes more sense to me.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, we're constantly connected with these greater selves, whether or not we recognize it and use that. You know, we have the ability to use that. And, you know, the idea of aspects really, you know, helps. And I haven't penetrated it much either. I'm still digesting this, but the idea of aspects is really something that, you know, it just goes beyond our own psyches, that we're aspects of each other, you know, and we're constantly connected with each other in these beautiful ways. So, you know, it goes everywhere.
Yeah, and the idea of having that connection, not just upward, but then also downward, as it were.
Yeah, exactly.
We mustn't forget the descent.
Yeah, you know, yeah.
And if I can recommend the review, we had Bill Plotkin on the platform last year, and I just reviewed his book, Journey as a Soul Initiation, which I highly recommend because there's all sorts of interesting parallels with Jung in it. And he comments on Jung's Red Book. So he's taken me to task for being too much about ascending and not enough about descent.
Well, I'm on his team.
Yeah, great. Peter, and then we'll go to another North of Scotland comment. I think you're in Scotland still.
Yes, we are. Joanne, that was a wonderful talk, and I enjoyed it very much indeed. In fact, you've almost answered my question, but not quite, because I'd like more precision in it, if I may. What do you mean by healing? What is being healed when all these people go into healing?
Well, they do mention physical healing.
Do you mean if you've lost an arm or something?
You know, they didn't go into that kind of detail. You know, I'm trying to remember, Peter, and I'm just not remembering any specifics about the healing that might, or how. I mean, I know that they do, and that we must heal. I think, you know, maybe Martin Luther King Jr. might be providing up some example where he says, you know, he was a man of some flaws. He was a flawed man, and that he had to heal those flaws. Well, you know, if you know about his, you know, his shortcomings, you might imagine how he would heal. But I don't remember any specifics. Sorry. Maybe that'll have to be my next book.
I think that there is a lot of people describe a kind of first stop, you know, which you've already alluded to, and then going on to further types of integration. And I think that's part of the healing as well. And that really brings in Abigail, who's got a very interesting comment at 2142. And I'd actually like to, if you could unmute her, Jerome, let's hear directly from Abigail, who is only a few miles away from Peter.
Hello. Hi,
Hello.
Joanne. Thank you so much for this talk. It was just lovely. I was really stunned by the comment on the need to integrate all aspects and try to do it as much as possible now in this life. And it's completely compatible with what I do in my work as a psychotherapist. Mm-hmm. Because Peter talked about healing, and what I know from my work now is that what opens the door towards healing, toward the possibility of people recovering even from the most horrendous traumas, is the integration of parts of ourselves. And I work with brain terminology, but some of the terminology that you used in your presentation that's in the book, which I'm going to read, is actually completely compatible with that. There's
Yes,
a sense of integrating some part of ourselves with some higher self, you know, which translates to two types of brain, but it's so compatible. And I feel entirely validated. Not that I really don't doubt what I do, because I can see the results of it. I'm a clinician, but it's just so wonderful to get a spiritual perspective coming from a completely different direction, which is just great. Thank you.
Thank you, Abigail. And two things come to mind when you say that. One is, I don't know that there are two types of brain. They have been so fused with my own brain that I have constantly asked myself if I was sane. I mean, that's how easy it has been to channel them. They're like natural parts of myself. So that's been, you know, an unusual experience. The other thing that I think of is a better answer perhaps to your question, Peter, you know, about what types of healing, because you know, we have access to all kinds of healing, and we have them in, you know, maybe not the old timey sanitariums that Jane Roberts talks about, but we have rehab centers, and we have psychoanalysts, and we have all kinds of healing, you know, guides and so on. Certainly, you know, the medicines now coming, the mushrooms and other things, guided trips, that's talked about too. Aldous Huxley talks about that, of course. So there are many different kinds of healings to do now. I imagine they're similar on the other side, because they're the same kinds of things that we're experiencing now. You know, we have access to those things. We don't always take advantage of them, and we don't have access to the best esoteric information to help, you know, provide a framework of all of it either. But my guess is, all I'm saying is that my guess is that they would be similar to the kinds of services that we would receive here, or else Harriet Tubman wouldn't have not needed. She didn't need any healing when she got to the other side. She was already, you know, a very evolved, mature person who lived a life of service.
Thank you. I'm just going to bring in Di Clift. Yeah, he's one of our vice presidents who's coming in from Vancouver. And she says, I was told from channeling they can adopt their old personalities, like putting on old clothes, so they can be recognized, and that they exist on all levels and in all incarnations at once, but can direct their attention to any level. That seems to make a lot of sense to me. I don't know if that makes sense to you.
That the source can direct their energy to anyone?
The characters, that they can adopt old personalities, like putting on old clothes, but they exist on, but in fact they exist at the same time. They exist on all levels and all incarnations at once, but can direct their attention to any level. And this morning I was reading a piece from Michael Rhodes where he said that the deeper meaning of time is that everything is in fact happening at the same time in the now.
Right.
And that's very hard for us to get our heads around, but I can sort of understand it intuitively. But it's pretty mind-blowing.
It is. And I'm going to tell you another one. And this pertains to one of the questions on chat. I'm sorry, I don't remember who said it. I just had a chance to read them briefly. But you talked about it too earlier, David, you know, about these Armageddon-like, you know, dramas, dark dramas that we're seeing all the time, you know, and is this going to be the end of our world, and et cetera? No, we can focus on other things we can. And that's the idea of probabilities and probable selves. So it relates to, of course, Schrodinger's cat thought experiment, where, you know, anything can, that reality can bifurcate at any moment now, and so can our lives, right? And so some of us are going to create those kinds of horrible end times, perhaps in another set of probabilities than what others are going to experience. And the other thing that's mind-blowing for me is that we also have probable selves who the one who went to college, the one who didn't go to college, et cetera. Douglas Adams talks about this a little bit in the book, that he's still writing and eating bonbons in Santa Barbara. You know, he didn't die. So that's another concept, I think, that's pertinent to this conversation, because yeah, those things might exist, and they will exist if people put enough energy into them, but they don't have to happen in our set of probabilities necessarily, as a group or as individuals.
Yes, I mean, I found the Einstein chapter extraordinary in that respect. They're stretching beyond what we know he already thought, if you like.
Yeah.
So here's another comment, Judy Hobart. I've also wondered about the idea of where each of these cells are communicating from. I think I have to put "where" in inverted commas here. What dimensions? It seems that we are each like a drop of water, and the individual drop ultimately dissolves into a bigger body of water. I'm not sure about that. Hard in a way for us in this dimension to think of the ego dissolving at some point. Dissolution? What's your
yeah,
I'm
not sure. I'm not sure the ego dissolves. I think their egos might be part of this blueprint self. And in fact, I had a similar question that I asked Hunter S. Thompson about why Rose would be involved, why these higher energies would be involved with these transmissions and not just Hunter coming through as Hunter. I didn't want to cheat people thinking that it was them and then they're getting these higher selves. I mean, that's the kind of questions, as crazy as that sounds. But he says that, that he says, I'm not going to be any different than who I was on Earth. Right. So if I were to just channel him, he wouldn't be any different, which I would imagine includes ego. Some of this stuff has to come from Rose, or this would not be the kind of book you will want to do. And I said, oh, what kind of book would that be? And he said, well, it would be full of bitterness and love for people who are still alive, who I need to contact in order to feel better about myself now, which is the kind of thing that I would approve of if I had not adopted this worldview that Rose has provided through my interacting with her. I said, thank you. I wouldn't want to do that either. It wouldn't be as insightful, and every dead person would want one, So that this higher self that's informing these people is getting them out of their ego self. But I think otherwise they would be in their ego self. That's what I'm guessing. I don't know for sure.
Well, we can tune into that ourselves.
Yes.
Each of us has a connection to something larger than ourselves, and that's what we're trying to become, something larger. At least I am.
Yes.
More universal.
And the ego is very important. I don't think the ego should be dismissed. I think that's another way that we kind of get confused. I'm so sorry about this phone. I think the ego has certain things that it absolutely needs to do. And I try to just tell my ego that I love her. I give her things to do. She's great at planning trips, keeping my schedule, things like that make her feel safe, while I go on and do my other things. So she's a well-loved, integrated aspect for me, but she doesn't define me.
Yeah, very good. Very good. Let's go on to Bernard. He's our president.
Thank you, Joanne. Joanne, what struck me is that most of your communicators are people who died relatively recently. I mean, in the last century, say. Now, I'm interested in relating what you're talking about to the early days of psychical research, where, of course, a lot of time was also spent communicating with people who died. And as you probably know, after the founders of the Society for Psychical Research died, that was Myers, Sedgwick and Gurney, they tried to communicate in what's called the cross correspondences. But that was a long time ago, because they died in 1903. And these cross correspondences were just for a period of 20 years. So the question I wanted to ask you is to do with the nature of time on the other side. You're not getting through these people, like those Myers, Sedgwick and Gurney who died 120 years ago. You're getting people who died relatively recently. So my question, I've often wondered from this perspective, if you're there on the other side, how long do you linger before you get bored? I mean, it relates to some other question somebody asked. What, do you move on to some other dimension or something? But just apart from the question of where they go to, I'm interested in the question of how long they hung around is not the right phrase, but how long do they remain there trying to communicate? I mean, do you think they will still be there in 100 years' time, or do you think they're just there for a short period? Because I realize the concept of time in that, on the spirit world, if you like, is different from the concept of time here. But nevertheless, one can still ask the question, how long do they linger from our point of view?
Well, thank you. That's a great question. And it really, gets to the heart of sort of what we're talking about. David mentioned simultaneous time. And I believe the answer is that they are around as these blueprints of who they were forever, that we have the option of tapping into these blueprints whenever we need to. It doesn't matter how long they've been gone. It doesn't matter if it's our great-great-grandfather, that is absolutely inconsequential, because these blueprints exist forever. And so I think that anyone with the intent of doing the same cross correspondences with these people who are in the blueprint state and are accessible would be able to do that. I think the only thing that it would take is the intent, their soul's design for expression, to be similar to these gentlemen who are doing the cross correspondences. But that could happen again as easily, perhaps, as they did in 1903.
Yeah.
In fact, I talked, Hildegard von Bingen, came through speaking German, living in the 12th century.
Yes, I was going to say that there are some people that go back a lot further than Thomas Paine, Goethe, and there are more recent ones than there are older ones, but there are some quite ancient.
I mean, of course, in the history mediums, there's lots of examples of people communicating with people, hundreds of years back, all the famous composers and things like that. But I was only going from Joanne's list. So would it be fair to say that the reason you're not picking up communications from Myers and Sidgwick and Gurney is not because they're not there, is in some sense because you're not so interested in them, because you don't have the immediate contact with them? Would that be a fair way of putting it?
Well, I wouldn't want to hurt their feelings by saying that I'm not interested in that. But I'm not aware of, I'm aware of that happening. I believe that's important work, but that wasn't the intent of, and I could try that, but that wasn't the intent of the book. The book was just to create the most helpful book for the reader, the probable readership, and to go from there. But I think, someone could write a book and totally do that again. I think that's very possible.
And since
just carry on,
Thank you so much.
I was going to, what may be a silly question really, you're always talking about people in the past, but since in some sense you're at a different level of time, does one ever get communications from people you've not heard of because maybe they're from the future or just aren't famous?
Well,
Yes.
John Barron was an example of that, you see.
Oh.
John Barron, and he's completely foreign. No, she didn't know who he was.
Yeah.
He said who he was.
Oh, so some of your communications are conceivably from the future.
Well, his isn't from the future, right?
But he's the past, present. He's
in the past, but I didn't know who he was. I wasn't
I see what you mean.
aware of him. That's what David's saying. But yes, we can contact those people in the future, because that's the nature of simultaneous time. In fact, Seth and Rose and Elias and all of those channeled sources call them focuses of attention of the soul. They're not really, in our terms, they're lifetimes, but for them, they describe them as focuses of attention, which, it takes the idea of time out of that name.
I see. So
that's really interesting, because that's what Bergson defined the brain as the organ of attention to life. So the brain helps us focus where we are. Most of the time.
Fascinating. Thank you very much, Joanne.
You're so welcome. Our brain is like our time machine, my husband says. What's the time machine? Well, it's our brains, because we're here.
We've got a comment. Some of you will know about the musical mediumship of Rosemary Brown. And the point that I think arises as a question here, they quote Liszt as saying, if you'd been too trained in music, we couldn't have, you know, you had too many theories and ideas of your own. And what the person's wondering about here, who is it, Simon, is what are your reflections comparing your work with Brown and on the presence of the collective / first person plural voice in selecting you? That's a very interesting question, because you've got the chairman of the board, but then you've got the board.
Yes, right. So it's I think it's a huge collaborative experience that is reaching into all kinds of proclivities of consciousness for the express purpose of creating one book. And it has to do, and how those are selected are according to our intent in life that we continue after we're no longer physical. So that, you know, so the I's and we's are really tough to keep track of. And I had to sort of explain it up front in the book so that people weren't confused. But, you know, I mean, all of us are we's, right?
Yeah.
You know, when it comes to when we embrace all of our aspects, you know, I probably would qualify as having a multiple personality disorder, right?
Yeah,
but,
we're not in that frame, luckily.
No, we're not. Thank goodness.
No, good. So Chris, Seth specialist.
Yes.
As well, Chris Johnson.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Joanne, for turning up.
Thank you, Chris.
I thought it was a wonderful presentation of the ideas that we've both been exploring for probably 20 or 30 years now. I was really going to, what Bernard was saying is why I put my hand up, because I have with me here a book that I introduced David to about 8 or 9 years ago, the After Death Journal of the American Philosopher, which is the channeled worldview of William James. And when I knew Joanne was coming on this evening, I thought I might prepare myself with some stuff, but then I thought, well, she knows her stuff, and I thought she's done a splendid job. However, in the cover of this book, I think goes to what Bernard was talking about here and gives a very succinct understanding of what the phenomenon of channeling worldviews is, what we're talking about here. And I'll just read. In psychic politics, Seth first described the worldview phenomenon. When individuals die, the sum total of their earthly experience survives them. And by putting ourselves in the mental and emotional site, in inverted commas, they occupied, it is possible to reconstruct the world as it appeared to them. In the After Death Journal of an American Philosopher, Jane Roberts recreates the attitudes and opinions of the turn of the century philosopher and psychologist William James from an after-death point of view. The result is a fascinating account of what an individual experiences after physical death, how the dead remain aware of earthly events, communicate with one another, become aware of past lives, and stop identifying with the physical body. In addition, this book offers a unique hindsight of the creative dilemmas each soul makes for itself during life, and the nature of consciousness and ESP, ending with a brilliant exposition on cultivating a useful optimism and practical faith in life. And I saw in the comments section, Di Cliff was saying something similar. It gives you faith about being alive and in the physical realm. And I highly recommend, after you've read Afterlives by Joanne Helfrich.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would endorse that. It's an absolutely riveting book. And I wanted to read, it's in my library in Scotland somewhere. And it's one of the books I wanted to dig out and have another look at. So, and William James is a hero for a lot of us on this call, I think, especially in consciousness studies, because he defined the filter theory of consciousness in 1898, drawing on the work of F.C.S. Schiller, who'd already written about it in 1891. And we're only just getting back to that realization. And Ian McGilchrist, has a version of this in his Matter with Things, a very sophisticated version, as you would expect from Ian. Thank you very much, Chris. Tadesh and Elizabeth, you've got another bite at the cherry there, and we've also got Viola who's coming back as well.
I have another question, really, whether Joanna or anybody else has come across this or thought about it. I have never heard of any transmissions from spirits of people who were in their living era extremely cruel, such as Stalin or Hitler. What do they think now are spirits?
Well, I'm sure those exist. Those transmissions exist and are possible. I'm not sure I would venture to say what kind of healing they would have to go through, to heal from their terrible experiences. I know that people have healed a great deal, Holocaust survivors and so on. So I imagine that would be helpful, but of course their perceptions of that, informed by their greater selves, I think would be wonderful parts of the greater body of work of channeling. I imagine someone may know better than I who's doing that.
I can't think of anyone or any material. There's maybe Jürgen Ziewer, Z-I-E-W-E-N. He might have written a little bit about this, because he has an experience of a suicide bomber in the afterlife, and who was experienced what it was like to be everybody who he blew up. This is a sort of, I think, a metaphysical ignorance, which is very dangerous, I think.
Well, yes, I mean, we talk about, someone like Hitler. What's his experience like? Well, it must be pretty horrible, once he realizes in his non-physical reality what horror he's caused to others. And, his would be a hell of his own making also, for which we aspire to have the kind of compassion that we would for anyone who is suffering, in that situation, to identify with our greater selves and go beyond, well, he deserved it, kind of, he's being punished, that kind of thing, but to go beyond that and have a sense of compassion for that soul and that soul's journey.
Indeed, that is the sage's perspective, to have compassion for all beings, even however difficult it is. But I do think, this is the argument in my book, Hole in One, now called Resonant Mind, that if you look at the structure and implications of the life review, then you realize that we are all one, we are one another. So that we comes back round the loop, both in a positive and a negative sense. And that seems to be, if we knew, if that was part of our kind of operating system, and we brought up education to realize that, then the world would be quite a different place, but we're not there yet. We just
yes, that's right. And I think too, the way that compassion has been defined sometimes gets translated as not holding people accountable. So when I say have compassion, I'm also saying that, sometimes the compassionate thing is to hold someone accountable. Often the compassionate thing is to hold someone accountable and insist that they can be better people. And I think that has to do with, our transition, or the kind of transition described as, from sinner to saint, gets there through their own volition, and their own, orientation towards goodness.
And I think that's a sort of ultimate optimistic faith in the human, and that there is this goodness attractor, if we can put it that way. Abayomi, you have another question.
Yes, please. I was just wondering, what it might reveal for someone, say like Joanne, in the process of channeling, having a functional magnetic resonance imaging of the brain.
Mm.
You spoke earlier on about Swedenborg, who has written quite a lot about this, and also people like Sanguch. They seem to be quite specific that the cerebellum is the point of connection between those who are channeling and those who are being channeled through. It is between those out there and the mediums.
Yes, well, that's an experiment for Peter, Peter Fennick, neurophysiologist. I think that there's been a little bit of work on mediums and brain scans, but I'm not familiar with it. I don't know whether anybody else is.
I have participated in one at the Institute for Noetic Sciences. I had, one of those caps with all of the connections all over it, and I did that. I was happy to know that I did have brain waves, but I'm not sure that it was conclusive. But that research is ongoing at IONS. I don't know if it's exactly as you described, but I know that those brain things are happening.
Animals. Do animals have these kind of healing and progression in the spiritual world too? There's a wonderful quote some of you may know, which says, "If there are no dogs in heaven, I want to go where the dogs go." You say cats.
Yeah, I think animals don't have to think about it a lot, but we humans do.
Yes, I'm just checking on this. Chris was holding up. Chris, people would like to know the after death journal of a philosopher. Is that what it is? The William James one.
Yes, it's by James. It's by Jane Roberts, and I think it's the After Death Journal of an American Philosopher, William James.
Right. So there we are. Afterlife Journal of an American Philosopher. Judy Hobart's put it in for everybody. Yes, and so is Chris. So that's all been replied. Helani Wabi, yes. Science of channeling. This is we have Helani coming up on the Imaginal Inspirations next week, and she's also speaking at Beyond the Brain this year. So there we go. I think we've come to the end of our questions, and a fascinating discussion it's been, and I just love it that we are a community where we can freely talk about these things. And exchange our views without looking over our shoulder and wondering whether our colleagues think we're completely off the wall. And we need to be adventurous. As humans, we need to be adventurous and be pushing the envelope out. And you've certainly done this, Joanne, with your book. And a lot of people are already saying, I've ordered it already, it's on my Kindle. So a lot of enthusiasm. And I think each of you, I'd be very interested to know eventually which chapter or chapters meant most to those of you who have read it. And I said the Goethe one, the Einstein one as well. The Hildegard one is an extraordinary chapter. And as Lance Butler said, you can't make it up. You must be tuning into something, form of higher intelligence.
I'm not the queen of this particular kind of fraud who would do something like that.
And we'll put in all the follow-up and the links and everything, the recordings, the PowerPoint slides, everything, all that will be attached to the recording email, which you'll go out in a few days. And so you won't miss out. And we'll try and put a couple of those book references in as well, just to make sure you've got them. But I think those of you who are really interested have got them already. So Joanne, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you too so much, David, and everyone.
Well, your very calm presence and the very logical way that you put these things forward and open-minded, we really appreciate it. So thank you everybody for coming.